in mixed martial arts, you cannot be a UFC championship with only one skill. No matter how good you are at what you do, you have to have all of the martial arts together to become a UFC champion. Or so we thought. There's no way anybody now could be an all-time great, a UFC champion, a top 10 fighter ever with just one elite skill. Well, there can be, and that's what we're going to go through today. We're going to go through the GOAT of every single attribute inside the UFC. Let's get right into it. Starting off, we're going to start off with power. Power is going to be somebody that nobody probably is thinking of right now. The names that come to your head: Alex Pereira, Ilia Topuria, maybe Conor McGregor in his prime, Francis Ngannou. None of those guys are the guy that I picked out. I picked out Dan Henderson. I think Dan Henderson is one of the freakiest KO power punchers that we've ever seen in mixed martial arts. He's KO'd people at middleweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight. And if you would have told somebody that was watching Pride back in the day that the middleweight champion would go on to KO the heavyweight champion later on, people would have called you absolutely crazy. And you don't even need to take my opinion for it. You ask the fighters themselves. The hardest hitting puncher that DC and Anthony Rumble Johnson said they ever faced was Dan Henderson. So the ability to take it from middleweight all the way up to heavyweight, and the longevity that it lasted for too. We know that power is always the last thing to go. You lose speed, you lose chin, you lose everything else, and you still have power. But to have KOs in 1997 and in 2016, and these are not TKOs like you'll see some other people have. We have like Tom Aspinall, don't get me wrong, really, really great KO power puncher, but he gets TKOs a lot of the time. He doesn't flatline people. Dan Henderson flatlines people. When you see his KO over Michael Bisping, it's one of the nastiest KOs you're ever going to see, and that's why he's down here for power. Talking about something that has nasty KO power, we're going to cardio next. Cardio, I know who you're thinking of right now, and it's not who you're thinking. Everybody on the planet is thinking of one guy when it comes to cardio, but I'm telling you, you're all wrong. You're not wrong. It's Merab. Merab, it has to be Merab. Who else am I going to say? Who else can you put together a good faith argument for as having the greatest cardio in UFC history? And not only does he have the greatest cardio in UFC history, he's almost redefining what mixed martial arts is. His cardio is so unbelievably good. You cannot do anything else. And every single fighter, I think if you're thinking about scariest fighters inside the UFC, you're probably going for who? Like Ngannou's in there, Ilia's in there, guys that just nobody wants to fight. I think if you ask a UFC fighter, it's Merab. I seriously think if you ask a UFC fighter, it's Merab. How many stylistic matchups have we seen him go up against? Wrestler, striker, Muay Thai, kickboxing, boxing, like any stylistic matchup that you can think of, Merab has gone up against it, and they have to change their game plan to fight Merab. How many UFC championship level fighters do you hear go into a fight and go, yeah, I just need to worry about this one thing that he has? Like Sean O'Malley completely changes his game plan to suit Merab. Corey Sandhagen goes into the fight completely thinking about Merab's cardio. And they're all kind of right to do it. You look at what he did to Piotr Jan, 50 takedowns against Piotr Jan, literally inhumane. If you've ever wrestled before, if you wrestle for like 3-4 minutes, you're gassed, you're dead. Merab does it for 25 minutes, being the aggressor all of the time. And then you watch what he did to Umar Nurmagomedov, where in that Umar fight, he lost the first 2 rounds pretty easily, and yet still breaks the guy for the next 3. So it has to be Merab. Then after that, we go to wrestling. Wrestling kind of linked in a little bit with cardio, I guess. Wrestling cardio, boxing cardio. I think that Khamzat is in a very, very similar category to Merab Dvalishvili, where you look at Khamzat and you go, that guy's probably the greatest wrestler ever. Like, when you watch what he can do with just wrestling, his striking, although I think it is a little bit underrated, like it's not Khabib level striking, it's definitely not great, and yet he still is going to go on to be one of the most dominant UFC champions ever. But for the wrestling GOAT for me, it's kind of tied. It's Khabib and GSP. I think that I'm going for GSP because GSP has longevity. Khabib has like a higher peak, but when you watch who GSP did it against, he did it against better wrestling competition. Khabib never faced an elite wrestler like he was, whereas GSP faced John Fitch, one of the best wrestlers inside mixed martial arts in general, and then he faced Josh Koscheck, who was a D1 champion. A Division 1 champion wrestler. You hear all about Bo Nickel and his accolades in wrestling. Josh Koscheck had very, very similar accolades, and yet GSP was able to out-wrestle him. And not only was he able to out-wrestle D1 champions, he never had any collegiate wrestling experience. I know that Khabib didn't either, but Khabib was over in Dagestan, so he was kind of doing his own thing over there. He would have never had it, whereas GSP probably could have and should have went through the US collegiate system when it came to wrestling, and he just never did. We're also not counting Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in here, because I think if you do count Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you go Khabib, because GSP's submission threat wasn't really all that much when you compare it to Khabib, who had real legitimate submission threat. If you're looking for finishes, you're probably not looking to Khabib's way, though. If you're looking for finishes, you're looking at boxers. You're looking at strikers. Who's the best boxer in UFC history? everyone's going to say Elite Taporia. Everyone's going to say Elite Taporia, and people are going to roast me for not saying Elite Taporia. And I promise you, I don't actually believe it's Elite Taporia. I think when we're talking about boxing itself, we take away power. Power is its own section. You get guys like Ilya, you get guys like Alex Pereira in that power section. I think JDM's a better boxer. I think straight up when you go boxing technique for technique, I think JDM is better. JDM probably has the best job inside the entire UFC. Like, I literally think he has the best job inside the entire UFC. And he's one of the only people that works the body well. That's kind of one of like the checklist things for me when you're trying to describe, is somebody a really, really good boxer or not? How well do they work the body? Because you see every single elite boxer, whether it's a 5-year-old or Terence Crawford, you hear them talk about working the body, investing in the body. Those body shots, they may not hurt in the first round, but they'll hurt in the 5th round. And JDM does that just about as well as anybody on the finishing sequences. JDM, don't get me wrong, has power, just not Ilya Taporia power. But JDM might have some of the best finishing sequences to be seen inside mixed martial arts. When you watch the end of that Bilal fight, when he's getting after Bilal, when you watch the Kevin Holland fight, like, it's clear that this guy is probably the best boxer we've ever seen in MMA. And for kickboxing, it's Israel Adesanya. Israel Adesanya is so unbelievably disrespected now. And I'm kind of interested to know how his career is going to finish. How are people going to look at Israel Adesanya in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years? Because right now, the way that people talk about him is crazy. Izzy is not in his prime, but when he was without doubt the best pure technique for technique kickboxer that the UFC has ever seen. He out-kickboxed Alex Pereira in every single one of their fights. He might have lost to him. Obviously, you have the power, you have that KO power that Alex Pereira has, which is fight-defining. It just changes the entire fight. But Israel Adesanya was out-kickboxing Alex Pereira in all of their fights. He beat Anderson Silva. He beat all of the kickboxing matchups that they threw at him in his prime. And obviously, the Sean Strickland fight, the Nasty Nimavov fight. Ever since that Alex Pereira 2 or 5 fight, depending on what you want to call it, Izzy obviously hasn't been the same. But when you watch him in his prime, he probably is the greatest question mark kick ever. Not even just talking about the UFC, talking about just ever in the history of kickboxing. Izzy probably is the greatest question mark kick ever. And I think in his prime, he was ridiculously underrated for his kickboxing acumen. Then we go to chin. One of the weirdest things in mixed martial arts. And there's some things like power, maybe like cardio, that we're going prime for prime. I don't need to see your cardio for 20 years. I don't need to see your power for 20 years, although it also does help. That's why I talked about it with Dan Henderson. Sometimes you watch somebody and you go, yeah, that guy's got unbelievably disgusting KO power. With chin, I think one of the biggest things is longevity, because there's a lot of guys who have great chins and then they get cracked and all of a sudden they're like, their chin's just absolutely gone to shit now. I think being able to say, I never got knocked out in my career, being able to say, I was the guy who had the best chin for my entire career inside the UFC is a huge thing. And that's why we're going with someone that's well-known, but also underrated at the same time. Nick Diaz literally formed a new archetype of UFC fighter. You see Sean Strickland right now? Sean Strickland doesn't exist without Nick Diaz. You see Merab right now? Merab probably doesn't exist without Nick Diaz. That kind of forward pressure cardio overwhelming you, he was the first of a kind in that kind of genre of fighter, and he did it unbelievably well. If GSP doesn't exist, Nick Diaz is a UFC champion. Nick Diaz is probably a long-standing UFC champion. He gets unlucky that the guy who is top 2, maybe the greatest UFC fighter of all time, depending on what you think about John Jones's drug use, that's the guy who he lost to. That's the guy who beat him. And Nick Diaz probably would have one of the closest fights to GSP outside of Johnny Hendricks and the losses that he has. I really think that Nick Diaz was right up there with a prime for prime GSP, and he never had his chin crack. Never had his chin crack. A lot of guys you'll see, people talk about Holloway, people talk about Mark Hunt, people talk about all of these different great chins inside mixed martial arts, but they all eventually got cracked. Nick Diaz never did. And then finally we go to IQ. I couldn't do a greatest attributes of all time list and leave, in my eyes, the greatest UFC fighter of all time. John Jones has the greatest mixed martial arts IQ ever. He's also the most talented mixed martial artist ever. And John Jones is almost kind of like when you watch somebody who's in the NFL play in high school, or if they're really, really good, in the NFL play in college, where you're like, he doesn't really get up for it unless he's playing someone that he thinks is as good as he is. Unless he's going up against someone that he thinks is a worthy opponent, he's not really going to try. He doesn't really care because he's going to out-talent them anyway. It's why you hear all the stories about John Jones not even training, going into UFC championship level fights. But when you think about his in-fight ability to change his game plan, his in-fight adjustments, I think, are as good as anybody ever. And then when you combine that with his game plan and going into the fight being probably the greatest ever, I think you can't look anywhere else. I truly think that you just can't think about anyone else. Look at the DC fight. Look at the Cyril Gane fight. Look at the second Gus fight. Look at the Lyoto Machida fight. The fights where he's doubted, He comes in with an incredible game plan and manages to beat the fighter. The fights where he underestimates somebody and they actually show him something where he's like, holy fuck, I didn't think you were this good. The Gus 1 fight, the Reyes fight, he loses the first 2 rounds and goes on to win the next 3. Although the Reyes fight is super, super controversial. We're not here to score that fight. But then you look at that and you combine it with his willingness to win or how much he wants to win. I think if you go through a human test in all of humanity, the armbar that Vitor Belfort had against him, how many people in the UFC get out of that? How many humans in general get out of that? I think he is in the 0.0001% of UFC fighters who get out of that situation. And I think even if you look at the same thing with the Gus fight, with the Reyes fight, if you lose the first 2 rounds in that, how many UFC fighters win that fight in that situation? I think it's very, very few. And it's why he's the greatest of all time. It's why he's got the greatest IQ of all time. But that is every attribute's GOAT inside the UFC. Please do make sure to like, subscribe to the YouTube channel. I'll catch you boys tomorrow. Peace.